good for our age. That's the corollary. Greeks age well. So just as a preface, a couple of years ago, my law firm had its retreat, and of course I volunteered to be in charge of the retreat, and of course I volunteered the shade for the retreat. And we rented it out and went to pawn shows. You can tell I'm a true Manhattan Beach native. And in the process of hanging out in Manhattan Beach for the retreat, I found in one of the stores a little history of Manhattan, a little bound history. And I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking and I'm looking. Farmers are mentioned, but not the Greeks. And I'm thinking, what the heck? And then a few years back, one of my aunts, because we Greeks are very shy, reticent people, got into it with a Manhattan Beach reporter, someone over there.
Yeah, the mic's right behind you.
One of our aunts.
Turn it on.
One of our aunts, now?
Yes.
Okay. One of our aunts years and years ago sort of kind of got into it with the Manhattan Beach reporter because of the lack of coverage of the Greek role in the development and the growth of Manhattan Beach. And so I don't know how, I think on Facebook or something I ran across you, and so we're here now because we want everyone to know what a wonderful, chaotic, crazy, and colorful history this family has and what role it played in Manhattan Beach and the surrounding South Bay cities. So before I do anything else, I'm turning on our background mood music. Okay, let's put it up on...
Is this the one that breaks the dishes after the Greek dancing music.
Can any of you hear this?
Yeah.
No, we need the air. Okay. All right, so... Okay. So, who's seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding? Okay. Some of us were a little offended by some of the caricatures of Greeks in that movie, but certain things are true. Similarities. First, my name's Demetra, and this is Angela. I'm named after our grandfather. She's named after our grandmother. Her brother's name is Mimo, Dimitri. I have a cousin named Mimi, Dimitri. We have a cousin named Angelica, named after our grandmother. We have...
well, my niece is
your
also...
niece.
Is,
so the naming thing really, we all have the same names, and you sort of have to sort us out by our nicknames. So our grandfather, Dimitrios Gerasimos Vangelatos, also known as Jimmy Vengel, was born in 1886. He came over in 1905. Greece was on the verge of war with Turkey, and he left. Now, Jimmy Vengel was something of a character in LA, and there are a lot of stories about him. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that when you're an immigrant in this country, especially when you come over in the 1900s, you got to be something of a scammer. So there are a lot of colorful stories you won't hear today about why he had to leave certain places and how he ended up here. Suffice it to say, he was on the East Coast, and he was mining coal for a while. Then he picked apples in Washington, and then he came down here. And to him, to us, he was Papu. Papu is Greek for grandfather. He sold his neighbor's goats. Yeah, that's another minor issue. And bought passage to the U.S.
you didn't go back and pay him back 30 years later.
Sort of, kind of. You know, I don't buy that either. But one thing I do want you to know is that Greeks, Italians, Southern Europeans, when they came over in the 1900s, were subjected to a great amount of discrimination. That discrimination continued into the 50s. My father came over in the 50s and was subjected to a great deal of discrimination and bias. And so life here wasn't easy. And most Greeks who came over in the 1900s had little to no money. So they started from nothing. So I think we're going to need to pull this up on the phone or something so we can show them the slides, because we got some great pictures for you. Okay, so this is the family. This is Jimmy, or Demetrios, the one I'm named after. This is Angeliki, the one Angela's named after, my grandmother Yaya Papu. 4'9", but man, you didn't want to mess with her. She was the tough one. This is Uncle George. He was a football star at Redondo Union High School. Aunt Louise, who is still alive today. Aunt Sophia, Uncle Jerry, Aunt Molly, who's still alive today, my mother, and Aunt Martha. We call this the off the boat picture, but it isn't really, because notice George, the eldest boy, is wearing an Angora sweater. Okay, this is at the house on Dianthus.
It's right on the corner of Boundary and Dianthus.
Right.
The house is actually still
Still
there.
there. We're going to show you a picture of it before and now. And when they arrived, they encountered a lot of empty lots, a lot of dirt, and a lot of sand. How far up from the beach? About a quarter mile? If?
Probably about 5-6 blocks.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad at all. Just as an aside, when we get into the farming, my mother used to tell me a story of how they would pick the flowers and then run down to the beach and wash off. And so it was something of an idyllic life. The air was always clean and clear, and you could always see Catalina. What more do you want in life?
They put, when they had the children, they married, and then they had children almost immediately, and put them to work. And
Are you going to tell about how Yaya came over, though?
oh yeah, I'll let you go.
Okay. No, you've got it out. You've got this.
Okay.
Microphone.
You know what? I didn't
Microphone.
Pardon? Okay.
Unfortunately, we couldn't split the screen.
Yeah, I'm trying to look at this. My grandmother came over here. I can't do both. I need bifocals. She came over here when she was 13 years old, and she was brought over by another Greek family who had been here since the late 1800s, the Priamos family. And they had also been farming throughout Manhattan Beach and Hermosa.
Who remembers Priamos flowers on PCH? Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
those are our
that
cousins.
was them.
They're actually our cousins. Our great-grandmother was a Priamos. And she
Yeah.
came over as well, Rebecca.
So she came over, but they had no money as well. So the Priamos family brought her over as an indentured servant. So she was in servitude to them until she paid off her passage. And
Oh, go ahead.
this
This is our family, by the way. Our family made her an indentured servant.
her own cousins did this to her. And they were shrewd, I guess is the best way to say it. But then a family gathering, one of the reasons our grandfather came out here is because he heard about this woman, or young child basically, from his village or the neighboring village, and thought, oh, okay, here California's great. There's some other people from our Greek heritage. I'm going to go out that way. And he heard of our grandmother and met her in passing and decided he was going to buy out her contract and marry her. And that happened when she was, I think, 16 she married.
1913.
Yeah. So that's how they ended up getting together, because your marriage wasn't arranged, but a lot of our cousins' marriages in our generation were
So
arranged.
we're 2 out of 17 first cousins, and we had cousins who had arranged marriages. So between 1918 and 1928, do you want to move to the next slide?
Yeah.
They had 7 children. And, okay, I have to stop for a minute. We're going to digress slightly. I located my great-grandmother's obituary. So her name was Rebecca Neff. Neff was short for Neferatos. When I go to I live in Pasadena. When I go to church gathering and people say, who are your family? I say, Vagelatos, Neferatos, Ambatelos, Geges, Priamos, Soteriou. And that's how we define ourselves. A lot of these names got shortened because, you know, multisyllabic words are difficult for people to pronounce. But Rebecca came over in 1909. We didn't find out until the 1980s that our great-grandmother was Jewish. It's just one of those, just one of those Greek things. But
Also, in Greece, they have the monasteries, and they they never allowed a female, anything that even resembled a female was not allowed in the monasteries. But when Hitler started taking over so many places, the monasteries hid all the Jewish young women. And it was one of the cousins of our grandmother. The only reason she survived the Nazi occupation was because of them hiding her in the monastery. So these are strong people that came here. So they had nothing, but they had opportunity. And that's why they came here. It was for opportunity, for a better life, so their children wouldn't be going to crazy wars. And then, as we all know, they did go to war, but it was just an interesting...
Can I switch pages? Rebecca, by the way, came over with her husband Spiros. We can turn it down, yeah. There you go. Rebecca came over with her husband Spiro. No one in our family is named Spiro. After him. He abandoned the family and went back to Greece and left Rebecca to fend for herself. One of Rebecca's sons is someone who was very well known in the community, Jerry Neff. Uncle Jerry was actually not a U.S. citizen, but pretended to be one, and went on to Cal in the 30s. And then he enlisted in the military, and then he became a beloved teacher at Redondo Americosta and Maryland in math. In fact, Peter B. Smith used to tell me that I should be ashamed of myself because you know, my math skills weren't as good as great Uncle Jerry's. The other child was Dionysus, or Denny. Denny, my mother used to tell me Denny they were all brilliant kids. Denny made his own biplanes, and so they'd be picking flowers, and Denny would fly the biplane over the fields. One day Denny decided he wanted to see how far he could go in the biplane, ran out of gas over Pasadena, ended up landing it in the Rose Bowl. And he called his brother Uncle Jerry, Neff, not her father, but our great uncle, to come the next morning to help him retrieve the plane. And Jerry didn't know how to fly a plane. Jerry just got there early, decided to fly it, and so when Uncle Denny showed up, the plane was in the bleachers, nose up, and I think that was the end of what they call the Snoopy plane. So these were creative, brilliant, interesting, colorful people, but again, they were fatherless. Go ahead. Let's go to the next slide. So Greeks settled in the beach areas in the South Bay primarily because the island that we came from, Kefalonia, which is known as Cephalonia, resembled the Manhattan and Redondo areas. Kefalonia is well known for the movie Corelli's Mandolin. The book is better. It was actually Sami, the village that it was filmed in, is our grandmother's village. It is a beautiful, beautiful island. So when the Greeks came over here, they saw a beautiful beach, and that was it. So you can kind of see what the attraction was for the location.
Our papu stood out. Our papu stood out and kind of walked through the different area, drove through, and when he hit the area that's now the hill section and looked out, he said to himself, and this is of course his story, that he looked out and he saw what he saw from his home village when he looked out of his, so it was so similar. They're on the same longitude lines.
Okay.
Latitude.
Okay, let's go. So these are the fields, and this is my mother. Great Uncle Jerry is actually standing right there. I don't know, is that Molly?
I think so.
That's Aunt Molly and my mother, and Great Uncle Jerry. We were laborers. My crib was in the fields. Very, very hard work. My mother had 4 children. She'd have a kid, and then a couple weeks later she'd be back out in the fields picking flowers.
Where were the fields?
Okay, it's on your.
They were all over the hillside. The entire hill section was covered with flowers. So all of from Ardmore up to Sepulveda, from Longfellow, all the way over to at least 2nd Street, and then
we jumped.
Yeah.
So Manhattan Village and the golf course, In fact,
flower
when
fields.
I lived up,
What is the years we're talking about here?
we had flowers into, Dad
The
bought the liquor
60s.
store in the 60s, right? Into the 60s.
Well, the hill section was not all flowers.
No.
No,
but-
by then, no.
Yeah, but
No,
if you were to go
That's got to
down
be back a lot earlier than that.
Rosecrans.
This has got to be late 40s, early 50s, this photo. Just, I don't
Maybe
know, looking at my
earlier.
mother, maybe earlier, you think?
Yeah.
Earlier.
But
East
if
of the
you-
highway maybe, but not west of
Yeah.
Sepulveda.
But if you, these pictures aren't from there. All of where the Del Olmo Mall is now, or
Yeah.
flower fields,
Okay.
next to Inglewood Cemetery, all
Remember when
throughout
Torrance was a
there
dairy?
were flower fields. They had flower fields on Rosecrans, where the TRW, what is it now? Raytheon, all of those, all surrounding a lot of those new buildings were all the flower fields.
They'd rent
in
from
the
SoCal
60s.
Edison. They'd rent from Edison. So my grandfather owned a lot of property adjacent to the Dianthus house. That was sold off, I believe, in the late 60s. And that whole area was owned by Greeks. What's that on PCH in Hermosa where Fatburger is in the market? That was a Stamus property, and they were from the same island. They shortened their name. Where the Priamos Florist was, a lot of that property on PCH was owned by the Greeks. They farmed wherever they could. I was always told that they rented.
They did a lot, but they owned property all
They
along
owned a
the
lot of
Pacific
property,
Coast
and
Highway.
who knows, they may have squatted too.
Because a lot of the people that had the dirt, they weren't making any money, so they paid them a little bit of rent, and those people would look out at their land, and there's these beautiful flower fields. So
Interesting story though. My grandmother had 9 children. She lost twins, so 7 of them lived. And the youngest, my mother was the baby, the youngest kids had to sell flowers, and they had red flyer wagons. They weren't in really good. My mother and her aunt and her sister described it as no rubbers on the wheels. They're squeaky wheels. They say my grandfather did that on purpose so the neighbors would know they were coming. And they would walk miles, and each of them had a route. And they had quotas. So my mother at 5 had a quota. And I don't know if I should tell this story in case a cousin sees this. I'm sorry. There's one story of one of my aunts going on her route and selling flowers in the rain, and the neighbor called my grandfather and said, "Jimmy, you know, come get your daughter, it's raining." And he came and got her, and then he dropped her off at somewhere else to finish her route. But you know what? This got us through the Depression, when so many wealthy families who had actually made fun of our family for being the backwards, funny-dressed Greeks were suffering. My grandfather had a farm on his property. He had animals on his property. They were able to sustain themselves during the Depression. And they helped their neighbors. So this was what sustained us. As far as when they sold off the fields, I can't say for sure. But I do know that he sold off the property he owned before the property values escalated. Otherwise I wouldn't be here, and I'd be living somewhere, you know, in a mansion.
I'd be living here. Yeah, there was, I hear my Aunt Louise tells the story of they'd go and the people, instead of them knocking on the door and waking everyone up at 6 in the morning, everyone started leaving money out on their front porch, and then they'd leave the flowers for them so that they didn't have to wake everyone up. But they'd take their bunches of change, and do you all know the cement street in Longfellow as you're going down the hillside and it's all cement? They would line up and organize all of their change up and down that street. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds doing that. When they got older, they worked in the fields, but at that age, they were out peddling the flowers. But it enabled them to buy this property because they lived poor. They lived off the land basically, and our grandfather was a brilliant businessman.
He would take his Model T and drive it to the flower mart and sell his flowers. So you're talking about a 24-hour kind of job.
Yeah.
And the DDT, which I think accounts for some of our peculiarities, they would, there's a picture of me in my crib in the fields, and they've got a football helmet on me. That was supposed to protect me. and they would put the DDT in a sock. Back then, DDT was cut with dioxin. And this is how they spread the DDT. Yeah, it was a hard life. It was a very, very hard life. These are a couple pictures we assembled of great Uncle Jerry. That's him over there. This is him with the tennis team. And then this is Uncle Dionysus, or Uncle Denny. Back in the day, 1926. I think he was visiting Death Valley or something.
He was working. They would take whatever jobs they could get, and they worked all the time, and it didn't matter. Like the gentleman that was here earlier talking, you took whatever job was available because they needed labor and you could make money. So he was a laborer on the road crew that built some of the roads throughout the Nevada and
even New York.
Oh yeah.
Denny helped build one of the bridges in New York. So they went wherever the work was, and the money was given back into the family pot. That was just the understanding.
It all went.
Yeah. Denny ultimately moved to Hawaii because he was a fan of Charles Lindbergh, and that's where he passed. And I've actually reestablished ties with his son Dionysus, who was in Denmark, of all places. So some of these photos came from Dionysus in Denmark. So,
should I go?
Yeah, go. Okay, so the church, notice what I'm wearing. This is a Greek cross, and look what's in the middle. It's an evil eye. We call it the Mati. So the church, from the moment you're born to the moment you die in our family, the church is a very important part. St. Catherine's on Nob Hill, we were a founding family of that congregation. And they used to meet in a furniture store.
McMahon's old furniture.
Yeah. What was it called?
McMahon's.
It was an old McMahon's?
An old.
But like upstairs or something.
Yeah, it was the upstairs part of the warehouse.
Right, and so we helped build the church. Father Naum was our first priest, and he baptized us. But more importantly, so we've talked about, Stomatula was a priamos, right? Yeah. So we've talked about the church. The first ordained nun in the United States was our second cousin, Stomatula, who became Sister Salome. And she is actually in the history book that's been compiled for St. Sophia's Cathedral in downtown LA. She was also my babysitter. Not a very good one. Not a very good one, but very much a part of the family.
And when she came over, she lived in the house over on Diantha Street. There was also another house that they had built that was on the corner of Boundary and with his Tennyson.
For our great-grandmother.
Yeah, so that corner of Boundary and Tennyson, which is basically Diantha's extension in Hermosa, she lived there. Our great-grandfather and grandmother lived there, uncle. So they would build small, very rudimentary homes, and that's where they would all live in communal living, basically.
Right, and when I was a little girl, we were living in the house on Gertruda Street near Burrell, in Redondo Beach, the 1895 Sears Craftsman catalog home, and that's where she babysat me. She ended up going back to Greece to die. A lot of the immigrants go back to the homeland to spend their final months. But church, very important. Always the cross, always the evil eye, because who knows who's casting a curse on me right now.
But anytime you are friends with Greeks, you're going to always notice that the baptisms, the weddings, the 3-hour-long weddings, and the baptism is huge. It's
ritual.
It's a community. It is with very strong structure of what will happen in life, how you're supposed to live your life, what's okay, what isn't.
Strong sense of family.
Very strong.
And strong sense of loyalty to family. Family first.
Yeah, and the Greeks stuck together. When my father married, he married what they called the first white woman, because they didn't consider themselves white at the time.
Well, we still,
yeah.
we're raised that way.
We're raised, you're not white, you're Greek. So when my father married my mother, my grandfather was not happy because he married an osprey, which is a derogatory term for a white person.
Also known as a xenophobia. We invented that word. The story goes that my grandmother, when she met Nancy, my dear aunt, my little 4'9" grandmother turns back to the stove, because she was always at the stove or the oven, and said, "God bless America." It didn't go over well, but Nancy ended up being the best Greek cook in the family, so
Because yeah, taught her.
yeah, I taught her.
She
So,
danced, yeah, all
move
of
this.
I think she was stronger in the Greek religion than a lot of the Greeks were.
Tell me the giant asters.
The Greeks were very inventive, and there were the flowers, and it's a very lucrative business, and that's partly why they stuck with it. But they started experimenting with different flowers and breeding them, and they bred the first giant aster, which was huge, and grew those throughout the whole Hawthorne area. They were the biggest breeders and growers of gladiolas in the United States. And
Dianthus.
all over, and those were all over on Dianthus and through 2nd Street and some of those areas.
But they grew dianthus too.
Yeah, oh, Dianthus,
Daisies.
the Marguerite daisies.
You just look at the street names, that's what
Yeah.
we grew.
But these aren't the actual fields because I could not find those. But
Hard to
these
find
are the
photos.
flowers, yeah.
Okay, here's the house. How many of you recognize this house on Dianthus? Take a look at it. Okay, this home, where's your little cheat sheet? We need to know exactly, because we have the data. This was the second home on this property. It was built, I believe, in 1936, I want to say.
I actually have the records, and it was 1928.
Yoti said 1936.
That's when it was done.
Okay. Well, was that house number 1 or number 2?
That was number 2. Yeah.
Okay, number 2. The interesting thing about this home is it never needed AC. It never needed heat because the walls were very thick. It was, what, 3-bedroom?
3 bedrooms on top, 1 bathroom with hot water, with heating throughout the house.
And then a basement that was fully functional with a bathroom.
Bathrooms.
And
a
then,
laundry.
right. And it sold in 2015, which broke my heart. And I still want, if anyone knows how to start cuttings and wants to help me, it still has the fig trees planted by my grandfather. It has hydrangeas planted by my great-grandmother, our great-grandmother. Those hydrangeas are at my dad Nick's house still. My mother had planted those, but the fig trees I want to get my hands on. But that's our papu. Is the picture next of him in his outfit?
Think so.
Yeah. Always very, very, you know that last scene in The Godfather, well, for The Godfather when he's dying, he's got the bug spray, and he's got his, his pants and his hat and that was our grandfather. Always dressed very nicely. Unusual to see him in the overalls unless he was doing some hardcore farming. But always dressed, always had the hat, always had the cigar.
People loved him. He was gracious. I think he was pretty crude because he was very humorous, and they'd gather all the men around and they'd all be sitting there smoking cigars, maybe drinking a little ouzo or wine, and laughing, hysterically laughing. So he had a great sense of humor, but he was also, as we spoke of, very, very generous man. He brought numerous cousins over, found them wives, made sure that they became citizens.
We have to tell the wife story.
Oh, okay.
All right, so 5 sisters, Louise, Martha, Molly, Dina, Sophie, all but one arranged marriages. So anyone who came into the LA area passed through Papu. He really was like the Godfather. And remind us to tell you about the Hooch. And he'd pick up guys who were officers in the Merchant Marines from San Pedro and bring them to the house and wine and dine them. And lo and behold, there are all these girls, and they were very cute girls sitting there, and he married them off. My mother, she wasn't the last. Sophie was the last, right, to get married? Well, anyway, my mother was the last.
Your mom was the last.
Was the last?
Yeah.
My dad was the only Merchant Marine who wasn't an officer, but he was drop dead gorgeous. And my grandfather actually got on his boat and went to the boiler room where my dad was a grunt, and someone said, "Do you want to meet, Mr. Ragalatos?" And Papu was dressed to the nines, and of course my dad's a grunt in the boiler room. And they said, "He's got a daughter," and my dad said, "Get out of here! I'm not getting married." And then my dad had an unfortunate parting with his boat and jumped ship. And without going into details because someone will murder me, Papu bailed him out, and lo and behold, he still had that daughter. It was a love match. It's a love story. All of those matches worked. It was amazing. And
all happy marriage.
all happy marriages, and but everyone, and I remember this as a kid, everyone who came to town had to meet with the boss, and you had to have a Zimper Mater in order to be within our Greek community, not just in the South Bay, but in LA. My parents were the third couple married at St. Sophia's Cathedral in Los Angeles. We were very much a part of the entire LA community, and he was very much a leader. Having said that, during Prohibition, Pop had a thriving business, and the story goes that he supplied not just the city council, but the mayor with their medicine.
The police chief, all of the police force, and it was always, and he'd give it to them because you couldn't sell alcohol, and he felt that it was important that everybody have medicine, but he made friends that way too. And instead of being the immigrant, he became very well loved by the Manhattan Beach people.
So here he is with our cousin Cole, and that's short for Angelica, same name as her. And there he is, but this was his typical outfit. I remember this as a child. And at some point a doctor said, Jimmy, you gotta stop smoking cigars. And he'd be working in the empty field next to Dianthus. And he'd see Mom drive up in her old Rambler, and I'd see the cigar drop. It was kind of funny. But you know, he always dressed, always the hat. Very typical of the time. And this is him with his straw hat, and obviously he'd been working in the fields.
Yeah.
Go ahead, this is your...
Okay, well this is, I think, did we tell the
This is
story
the rib
about,
breaker.
Yeah, about my grandfather, the war starting again in Greece. His name was Evangelatos, and he did not want to be drafted because he knew it was just a wasted war and it was horrible. So he changed they were drafting alphabetically, so he changed his last name to Vangelatos. And by the time they got to his name, he'd already hightailed it out to the United States. So flash forward, World War II. Very patriotic man. He was an American Greek. As far as he was concerned, he was American, and this was the best thing that had happened to him in his life, was coming to this country. Felt very strongly about that. Well, Pearl Harbor happened. Within a day, both his sons enlisted. My dad was only 17 and lied about his age, like so many young men did. And my uncle, like Mitzi said, had been accepted to Loyola Marymount to go to school, and he says, no, I can't, I have to go to war, I have to help. So they both enlisted, and this is a picture of my father, who was in the Air Force, and then my uncle, who's I couldn't find any pictures of, was in the medics.
He was an Army medic.
Yeah.
I think he was an Army medic, and because he was chosen as a medic because he was so buff, being a football athlete, and he landed at the beaches of Normandy, and his job was grisly.
Yeah.
His job was absolutely grisly, and it did result in a permanent cognitive impairment. And I will tell you though, typical Greek family, that man lived in Dianthus till the day he died.
And he was cared
And all the
for.
sisters took care of him.
Cleaned the
Typical,
house, made sure you had food, and we had the wonderful next door neighbor who was always there kind of watching over him. But my father was in the Air Force, and he was the guy that made sure the bombs got out, and he was bombed. He shot down twice. The first time he was rescued by the French underground, but the second time he ended up in a German prison camp, which probably saved his life because he was there for a little over a year.
Tell him how he survived though. You know that.
With the rations?
No, with the Greeks.
No.
Oh, I know the story.
The plot.
By the way, in a Greek family, love means never having to substantiate your story. Please don't show this to any of my relatives. So Uncle Jerry, according to my mother, made friends with the Greek soldiers. The Greek soldiers were treated better than the American soldiers by the Germans. And I don't know if this is true because I thought the fences were electrified. I don't know if they were in prisoner of war camps. But the story was that the Germans would look the other way. The Greeks would lift the fence, go under, grab an animal, come back, slaughter it, share the meat with the Germans and eat. Jerry came out alive and intact.
He was barely over 100 pounds, but he was
Better
alive.
than the rest.
And they literally just unlocked the gates. And so, but at one point in time, and it was a New Year's Eve, my grandmother received 2 telegrams over on Diantha saying, "Your sons are missing in action. We don't know where they are," which basically to them meant her sons were dead. So, and they both came home safe and sound as much as you could be.
When Uncle Jerry came home, Papu dug a huge pit and roasted a pig. So sometimes when I hear my Latino friends talk about roasting animals in a stone pit, that's what my grandfather used to do. In a huge festival, all the Greeks came to pay their respects, and both sons came home, and that was the most important thing to our grandparents. But equally important, and it should be noted, who was minding the field? The women. The women. So, and actually while the women were minding the fields, business picked up. I'm just pointing that out because I think it's important.
They also were the ones that went to market with the flowers, negotiated the pricing. They were great businessmen.
There's a story that my mother, who was a very stubborn individual but an extraordinarily shrewd businesswoman, a prominent Greek in town owed them money for the flowers they had sold him, and he wasn't paying. And everyone said, no, politically you can't do that. He's going to shun us. We're going to be ostracized, another Greek word. And my mother went to his offices in downtown LA, dragged my Aunt Molly, and sat there until the man paid her. So it's just an example of the resilience, the stubbornness, the perseverance that our family exhibited and what sustained us. And you know what? They passed it on to us. As an attorney, I've been in the same field of law since 1988, and people at court joke, "Don't mess with the Greek." And it's kind of funny to me because this is what I inherited from those 3 women, and from my mother, and from my grandparents. And Angela and I are very similar in that regard. You mess with us, we dig in our heels. I always say Greeks, Jews, and elephants. And since we got a little bit of Jewish in us, we're doubly bad to deal with.
But we're nice.
So as a result of all this, I don't know what the next slide is, but as a result of all this, in that little, oh, okay. All right, so we're going to really quickly show you these. I know we're going over time. So that's my mom, that's Dina, that's Sophia, that's Louise, that's Molly, and Martha's over here. Actually, this is a poor photo of them. They were absolutely gorgeous. Louise was a dead ringer for Merle Oberon. Who remembers Merle Oberon? Yeah. This is a typical Greek wedding because my grandfather was a leader in the community. When one of the girls got married, it was an all-out, they talk about Indian weddings. It was like that all-out event. This is at St. Sophia's Cathedral in Los Angeles. Many days of celebrating, many days of eating, drinking, and only the best gowns, the best of everything. That sort of celebrating extended into our generation. We were kids. It was not unusual for us to have huge parties in that little house on Diantha, spilling out, like the movie. That part of the movie is true, with everyone out on the front lawn.
Well, and that's kind of an example. We would have the parties, and there'd be a couple hundred people there. It was all Greeks from Manhattan, Hermosa, and Redondo. So you'd have, the Greeks were so prolific and so integrated within our society here, and they spoke beautiful English. Everyone learned to speak English. They became educated because education was highly esteemed in Greece, and women were not allowed to be educated. So
in Greek families, the father's sort of the straw, what's the term, straw tiger, and the mother rules the roost. And it wasn't until after my mother passed away that I found out that she actually had her AA, because Dad was uneducated, and she didn't want to offend anyone offend him by telling anyone that she had a degree. She had a degree. So it was an interesting society. It was very hierarchical. We are at the bottom of the 17, so like in terms of the pecking order, there's no pecking where we are on the list. So this is Angela and I went through school together. We went to Penny Camp, we went to Maricosta, we went to Beg. And so people say it's always and my nickname's Mitzi if you haven't figured it out. Dimitrios, the nickname is Mitsu, I became Mitzi.
And Angeliki was Angela, which is me.
Yeah, so everyone always says, oh, it's the Mitzi and Angela show. Here's Angela being choked by my brother, and here's me, and then here's my mother and my Aunt Molly with my cousin Olga Tabernikis, who resides in Palos Verdes, and then Vanna Bacielos, the eldest cousin in our family, was a very well-known Spanish teacher at Palos Verdes. Hi, I'm not sure if he taught at Maricosta.
No.
He then went on to own United Melon, and those little cheese triangles you buy at Trader Joe's, I think they're his.
They are.
Yeah. He lives in LA now, but he's also on the Planning and Safety Commission for the city of LA. And that's my mom with my older sister Calliope. Calliope was named after my father's mother. Also happens to be one of the 3 Greek muses.
So each one of the women who married settled in Manhattan Beach. One, our Aunt Louise still lives on 9th Street. Our Aunt Molly lives on Longfellow. We lived in the house in Dianthus for quite a while. Another aunt lived on 9th Street with her family. Where else? Your family lived on Peck Street.
We still live on Peck Street.
Gate Street. So they just, because the rule was for my grandmother, I need to be able to walk to your home. That's it. There are no options. You do not leave within a walking distance from me. I need to see my grandchildren. I need you here. And it grew. So there were always children.
How many of you grew up here? Okay, so you know the story. We couldn't sneak out. We couldn't get away with anything. Every time we tried to do something sneaky, Mom would say, a little bird told me. And it was either a family member, a cousin, an uncle, someone we didn't even know how they were related to us, or a neighbor, or someone Mom knew from school. There was no hiding in Manhattan Beach.
We were terrorized.
But we were blessed. We were blessed. It was a safe place to grow up in. And I was saying earlier, from the house in Peck, which is on the other side of the trap, well, it's here, down the street, I would walk in my bathing suit with a towel with no money, barefoot, down to the beach, and I knew where I could stop if I needed something. So it was an idyllic childhood, and we were surrounded by a lot of cousins. But unfortunately, all things end. I don't know how many of you have seen that Avalon movie by Barry Levinson, very similar. You know, everyone spread out, and the family, to a certain extent, has, I hate to say disseminated or deteriorated, but we've gotten big, and when you get big, you lose touch with people.
This is
just another.
A couple of that's one of the Greek festivals that they had.
We actually have a video from the 50s from a Greek festival, and then this is Mom at the beach with all of my cousins.
That's right down on Longfellow.
Yeah, it's right down on Longfellow.
More parties. This is all 3 of
That's
these.
the Greek festival. Yeah. That's the Greek. That can't be. That could not have been.
No,
Dianthus. But this was typical, and this is my dad Nick right here. This is Pete Vagelatos, and that's Old Man Tabernikis.
And all these men lived in Manhattan Beach throughout the years. They've since moved. Well, none of them. Your dad's the only one that's alive.
Yeah. So the last. Why don't we go? Okay, so that's my cousin Olga's wedding. That's Mom and Dad. And then there's Angela. We had to put a tutu picture in. There's Angela. You know, I have to say, it had to have been hard for Angela because the rest of us had a certain look, and then there were the Vengel kids.
My siblings were pretty dark. I was just as white could be. But
they called us salt and pepper.
Yeah. My grandmother adored me because I was named after her. So, okay. And this is. Same thing with this gentleman on the left. It was later in years. He came and lived with us because we had extra room in our house over on Magnolia Street. And that's a picture of, he spoke a little bit of English, but he came to my ballet recital. And
that's
Piccolo Pete.
That's Pete Vagelatos. Yeah, I was his flower girl. He's his flower girl. So, okay, so Papu in his later years, Yaya died in 1968, and Pop died 2 years later. He couldn't live without her. He couldn't live without her. But that's him with my mother. Again, after Yaya died, Pop was treated extremely well. His sense of humor did not abate. My younger sister Maria, who's about 5 years younger than me, I have a story. We were alone in the living room with him, and all the women were in the kitchen. And he took his false teeth out, and Maria was like a little teeny thing. He took his false teeth out and she went running into the kitchen screaming, Papu took his teeth out at me, Papu. The women came in, he had teeth in, he's like this. And then he did it again. He always a wicked sense of humor, and his jokes in Greek were filthy. The filthiest jokes ever. This was about a year before Mom passed.
Yeah.
About a year. That's my mother and my godmother Molly. They're drinking wine that my dad made at the Peck Avenue house down the street. And if you drive by 426 South Peck, you'll see the grapevines. Dad's made a pergola out of aluminum ladders. And he's got grapes coming in. And every summertime, he's known, he just finished his green season. His red chard was amazing. Tomatoes, zucchini, beets, and he makes his own wine when he gets into the mood. But that's in our mentality, this farming thing. She's moved to Los Osos and she still plants. It's something we were raised to do.
You got it. It's the dirt.
It's in our blood. And that was one of the more recent photos of us with, here's Aunt Louise. She is an amazingly gorgeous woman. Aunt Molly, my godmother. There's Nancy, Angela's mother. And then Angela, me, and then our cousins. Here's my other cousin, call Angelica. She's a really well-known artist in town, Angelica Rausch. I don't know if anyone knows the Rausches. That's another family in Manhattan Beach. And then this is one of the last group photos. And Uncle George, he was ill. But there's Jerry. Look didn't change.
No, he looked like that till the day he died.
He did. He loved life. This was taken just, last weekend? Last weekend.
I think so. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
so that's Aunt Louise, 98. Gorgeous woman. That's one of our eldest cousins, Peter Soterio, who was a professor. And that's Dad. That's Nick. And that's Dina, my mother, Louise, and Molly. And once Mom passed, these two women were devastated. They were so tight. They were hugely affected by it, as was the rest of the family.
I think your mom called them seven little, oh, let me go back, sorry. Let's see. So, in true style, I knew the house we were going to be selling it, and we decided to have one last hurrah, and it was the baby shower for the 4th generation, and this is the last
great
party.
or great-great-grandchildren?
Great-grandchildren.
No, great-great.
Great-great-grandchildren. So,
it was bittersweet. It was just horrible saying goodbye to the house. And when I drive by, because Molly still lives nearby, it's very painful. It's very painful.
But we had the whole backyard. We had vegetables growing, roses, lemon tree. I used to take my figs and sell them to the people that would go to farmers markets because they were such beautiful, wonderful figs. If I didn't get beat by the crows. So,
one thing I do want to tell you is that of all of the cousins, we have professors, we have very successful businessmen, we've got people in the movie industry out of the cousins. We have one lawyer, doctors, everything. And so we do feel that Papu's established a very solid foundation for us. And I myself, every day I'm thankful for the background I had. It was crazy, it was chaotic, it could be misogynistic, it could be draconian, but it was us.
you know what, all the kids ate. That was the thing. We all ate. There was no abuse. There was a lot of sick.
Well, I don't know about the abuse.